The forest was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves as a soft breeze danced through the trees. Ethan had chosen this remote spot to escape the noise of his everyday life. His small campsite was a cozy setup, just a tent, a fire pit, and his trusty backpack. The stars overhead sparkled brightly, unfiltered by city lights, offering him the peace he sought. But as he settled into his sleeping bag, a faint sound reached his ears. It wasn't the usual calls of owls or the rustling of animals. It was something else, human-like, yet strange. A cry. Faint, desperate, and haunting, it echoed through the dense trees. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. Help. The word was faint but clear. It was enough to make Ethan sit upright. Grabbing his flashlight and a knife for safety, he hesitated for a moment. Who would be out here at this hour? Was it a prank, or worse, a trap? But the cry came again, softer this time, as if the person was losing strength. He couldn't ignore it. His sense of right and wrong wouldn't allow it. "Hello," Ethan called out as he ventured into the darkness. His voice seemed to vanish into the vast forest. The beam of his flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing twisted roots and low-hanging branches. Every sound, his footsteps, the snapping of twigs, felt unnaturally loud. The cry for help was growing weaker, and Ethan quickened his pace, guided only by the faint direction of the sound. After several minutes he found her. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the shadows. But then the light from his flashlight fell on a figure slumped against a tree. A young woman, though unlike anyone Ethan had ever seen. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale blue hue that seemed almost translucent under the moonlight. Her hair, long and white as snow, draped over her shoulders. She was dressed in what looked like a sleek, silver suit, torn and scorched in places. Blood, if that strange, silvery fluid was blood, streaked her arm and leg. "Hey, are you okay?" Ethan asked, rushing to her side. She flinched at first, her wide, glowing eyes filled with fear. Her lips moved, but the sounds that came out weren't in any language Ethan understood. "It's okay," he said softly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I won't hurt you." The woman relaxed slightly, though her breaths were shallow, and her body trembled with exhaustion. Ethan scanned her injuries. The wounds were deep and unfamiliar, burn marks that didn't look like anything caused by fire. He tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped it around her arm, trying to stop the bleeding. She winced but didn't pull away. "Can you walk?" Ethan asked, motioning with his hands. She seemed to understand and tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. Without hesitation, Ethan scooped her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body cold against his. As he carried her back to his campsite, Ethan couldn't shake the questions racing through his mind. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why was she here, in the middle of nowhere? The forest seemed eerily silent now, as if it too was holding its breath. Ethan felt the weight of her fragility and the responsibility he'd just taken on. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but he knew one thing: he couldn't leave her behind. Reaching his camp, Ethan carefully laid her down by the fire. Her breathing was still shallow, her eyes fluttering open and closed. He grabbed his water bottle and held it to her lips. She drank a little, her trembling hands brushing his. For a moment, their eyes met, hers filled with confusion and fear, his with determination. "Don't worry," Ethan said softly. "I'll help you. Somehow." As the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows around them, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet weekend in the forest had just turned into something extraordinary and dangerous. The fire crackled softly as Ethan sat close to the injured woman, trying to keep her warm. She was barely conscious, her head leaning to one side, her breaths shallow but steady. Ethan's mind raced. She didn't look human, but she was clearly alive, clearly vulnerable. Whatever, or whoever, she was, she needed his help. He leaned forward, checking the makeshift bandages he'd wrapped around her arm and leg. The silvery fluid had stopped seeping, but her wounds still looked strange, as though they had been caused by something otherworldly. He wished he had proper medical supplies, but this forest camping trip was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, not a rescue mission. "Can you understand me?" Ethan asked softly, not expecting an answer. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were a soft shade of violet, glowing faintly in the dim light of the fire. She looked at him, her expression shifting from fear to something that resembled trust. Her lips moved, forming words that sounded melodic but alien. Ethan shook his head, frustration tugging at him. "I don't understand," he said, gesturing helplessly. "But it's okay. You're safe now." She reached a trembling hand toward him, her fingers brushing against his arm. Her touch was cold, almost icy, but it felt deliberate, like she was trying to connect with him. Ethan stayed still, letting her take the lead. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, as if summoning strength. The next moment, she pointed at herself and spoke a single word. "Soraya." "Soraya," Ethan repeated, testing the sound of her name. She nodded weakly. He placed a hand on his chest. "Ethan," he said slowly. She tilted her head, then whispered, "Ethan." Ethan smiled despite the surreal situation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The connection, however small, gave him hope. As the night stretched on, Ethan tried to piece together her story. Using simple gestures, Soraya managed to communicate fragments of what had happened. She pointed toward the forest, motioning an explosion with her hands and mimicking the sound of something crashing. Ethan guessed she had been in some kind of accident. Her burned and torn suit, along with the strange metallic device she clutched earlier, seemed to support his theory. But what was she running from? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise in the distance. A faint hum, mechanical and low, drifted through the trees. He froze, listening carefully. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was something unnatural. He glanced at Soraya. Her eyes widened, and she gripped his arm tightly, her fear palpable. "Someone's looking for you," Ethan murmured. He grabbed the flashlight and quickly extinguished the fire, plunging them into darkness. He crouched low, pulling Soraya closer to the ground, shielding her as best as he could. The hum grew louder, accompanied by faint beams of light scanning through the trees. Ethan's heart pounded. Whoever these people were, they didn't seem friendly. Soraya's trembling confirmed his suspicion. He could feel her body tense against him, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Stay quiet," Ethan whispered. They stayed hidden, pressed against the ground, as the beams of light moved closer. Ethan could make out faint silhouettes now, figures in sleek suits, carrying devices that pulsed with an eerie blue glow. They moved methodically, scanning the area, their movements precise and military-like. Ethan held his breath, his fingers tightening around the handle of his knife. One of the figures paused, turning in their direction. Ethan's grip on the knife grew tighter, but before the figure could move closer, a distant noise, a snapping branch or animal call, drew their attention away. The group shifted, heading in the opposite direction. Ethan didn't move until the hum of their devices faded into the distance. Slowly, he exhaled, his muscles aching from tension. Soraya looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude and lingering fear. "I don't know what's going on," Ethan said softly, "but I won't let them hurt you." Soraya seemed to understand. She placed her hand on his again, her touch lingering for a moment. Ethan could feel the trust growing between them, fragile but real. Whatever danger lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave her. Not now. As the forest settled into silence once more, Ethan began packing his gear. They couldn't stay here. If those figures were searching for her, they'd come back. He glanced at Soraya, her violet eyes following his every move. "We need to move," he said firmly. "I'll get you somewhere safe." And with that, their journey into the unknown truly began. Ethan led Soraya deeper into the forest as the first light of dawn crept through the canopy. The forest felt alive, every rustling leaf and snapping twig sounding like an alarm to his ears. His steps were quick but quiet, his hand steady on Soraya's arm as she limped beside him. She was weak, but determination shone in her violet eyes. "We'll be safe if we keep moving," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. He glanced back occasionally, scanning for any sign of the strange figures from the night before. The thought of them closing in sent a chill down his spine. Soraya stumbled, her strength faltering. Ethan caught her before she fell. Her pale blue skin was cooler than it should have been, and her breathing was labored. "You need rest," he said gently, but Soraya shook her head, her silver hair catching the faint rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. She pointed forward, her expression pleading. "All right," Ethan sighed, hoisting her arm over his shoulder to support her. "But if we're going to keep moving, you need to tell me when you can't go anymore." "Got it." Soraya nodded faintly, and they pressed on. An hour later, they stumbled upon a shallow stream. Ethan stopped, crouching to fill his water bottle. Soraya knelt beside him, cupping her hands to drink directly from the stream. For the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of relief cross her face. While she drank, Ethan examined their surroundings. The forest was dense here, the trees taller and their trunks wider, creating natural barriers. It was a good place to rest, but it wouldn't keep them hidden forever. As he scanned the area, a glint of light caught his eye. High above, something metallic hovered silently, reflecting the sunlight. A drone. "Get down," Ethan hissed, pulling Soraya into the cover of nearby bushes. The drone's lens rotated, scanning the ground. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched it move, its sleek design and eerie silence confirming it wasn't anything human-made. He held his breath, gripping the knife in his pocket, but the drone didn't detect them. It hovered for a moment longer before zipping away, disappearing into the trees. Ethan exhaled, his body tense with adrenaline. "They're tracking you," he whispered, turning to Soraya. She nodded, her expression filled with both fear and apology. She gestured to herself, then to the sky, and finally to the direction the drone had gone, her movements quick and urgent. "I get it," Ethan said. "They're after you. But why? What do they want?" Soraya hesitated, then touched the strange metallic device she still carried. It looked like a small tablet, sleek and glowing faintly with unfamiliar symbols. She tapped it, showing a holographic image of what appeared to be her ship, now a smoldering wreck. Ethan recognized the location immediately. He had seen the crash site during one of his scouting trips. "That's where they're searching," he realized. "But why come this far if the wreck's over there?" Soraya didn't respond with words. Instead, she touched her chest, then pointed to the device. Ethan understood. Whatever they were after, it wasn't just her. It was something she carried. The sound of voices broke the moment. Low and guttural, they echoed faintly through the forest. Ethan's blood ran cold. The pursuers were close. He gestured for Soraya to stay low as he crept to the edge of their hiding spot. Peering through the bushes, he saw them. 3 figures in black suits, their faces hidden behind helmets. They moved with precision, scanning the area with handheld devices. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them, not in Soraya's condition. He had to think fast. "Stay here," he whispered to her, motioning for her to remain hidden. She grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear, but he shook his head. "Trust me." Using the terrain to his advantage, Ethan slipped away, moving silently through the trees. He found a cluster of rocks and grabbed a large one, hurling it far into the distance. The sound of the crash drew the pursuers' attention instantly. "Over there." One of them barked in a language Ethan didn't understand, pointing toward the noise. The group moved toward the distraction, their scanning devices glowing faintly as they followed the sound. Ethan returned to Soraya, his breath ragged but his expression calm. "We've got to move now," he said firmly. She nodded, her trust in him evident. Together, they disappeared deeper into the forest, leaving the pursuers behind. For now. But Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up again. He needed a plan, and fast. As they pressed on, Ethan couldn't help but glance at Soraya. Who was she really? And how far was he willing to go to keep her safe? Those questions lingered as they vanished into the shadows of the forest. The hunt far from over. The forest grew denser as Ethan and Soraya pushed farther into the unknown. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above, leaving them in a world of shadows and faint rustling sounds. Every step felt like a gamble, each noise a reminder that their pursuers might not be far behind. Ethan glanced at Soraya, who was struggling to keep up. Her pale blue skin had taken on a faintly dull tone, and her breathing was shallow. She clutched the strange device tightly, as if it were her lifeline. He stopped and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's rest here for a moment," he said softly. Soraya hesitated, glancing back the way they had come, but her body betrayed her exhaustion. She nodded and sank onto a fallen log, her silver hair falling over her face. Ethan handed her the water bottle, and she drank deeply, her hands trembling. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan said, trying to lighten the mood. Soraya looked up at him, her violet eyes meeting his. A faint smile flickered across her lips, though it was fleeting. Ethan crouched beside her, scanning the forest. The quiet was unnerving, broken only by the occasional chirping of birds. "We need a plan," he muttered. "We can't just keep running. They'll catch up eventually." Soraya tilted her head, listening intently. She gestured toward the device she carried, then mimed a circular motion with her hands, as if creating something. Ethan frowned, trying to understand. "You want to fix it?" he guessed. Soraya nodded, her expression hopeful but anxious. She tapped the device, showing another holographic image. This time, a beacon-like structure. Ethan realized she wasn't just carrying a random piece of tech. It was something vital. "It's a signal, isn't it?" Ethan asked. "You're trying to call for help." Soraya's eyes lit up, and she nodded again, relief evident in her face. But her expression quickly darkened, and she gestured to the dense forest around them. She mimicked the sound of footsteps and pointed back toward where the pursuers had been. "They'll find us before you can finish it," Ethan said grimly, understanding her fear. Determined, Ethan stood and scanned the area. The terrain ahead looked promising, a steep hill covered in thick vegetation. If they could get to higher ground, they might find a spot to work on the device without being easily detected. "Come on," Ethan said, offering her a hand. "We'll find a safe place. I'll buy you time to fix it." Soraya hesitated, clearly reluctant to rely on him, but eventually took his hand. Together, they began the climb. The path was rugged, with loose rocks and thorny bushes slowing their progress. Soraya stumbled a few times, but Ethan caught her, his patience unwavering. Halfway up the hill, Soraya stopped suddenly. She pointed to a cluster of trees, their trunks unusually wide and twisted together, forming a natural hiding spot. Ethan inspected the area and nodded. "This'll work," he said. "It's hidden, and the height gives us an advantage." They quickly set up a small makeshift camp. Ethan piled leaves and branches to camouflage the area while Soraya began working on the device. She sat cross-legged, her delicate hands moving with surprising precision as she adjusted its components. Ethan watched in awe, realizing just how advanced her technology was. The piece didn't last long. As Soraya worked, Ethan heard faint voices in the distance, low, guttural tones, growing closer. His heart raced. He grabbed a long branch, fashioning it into a makeshift spear with a knife from his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "We've got company," he whispered to Soraya. She looked up, panic flashing across her face. She gestured frantically at the device, which now emitted a faint hum, as if coming to life. Ethan nodded. "I'll hold them off. You finish that." Without waiting for her response, Ethan crept toward the sound of the approaching voices. He moved carefully, his footsteps silent on the forest floor. Through the thick trees, he saw them, 3 figures in black suits, their helmets glinting faintly even in the dim light. They moved in formation, scanning the area methodically. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to draw them away from Soraya. Picking up a rock, he hurled it toward a nearby thicket. The loud crash it made immediately caught their attention. There, one of them barked, pointing toward the noise. They changed direction, moving away from the hill. Ethan returned to Soraya, his heart pounding. "They're close, but I bought us some time," he said. Soraya gave him a grateful look, her hand still working furiously. The device began to glow faintly, its hum growing louder. Whatever she was building, it was almost ready. Ethan crouched beside her, gripping his makeshift spear tightly. "Hurry," he whispered. "We don't have much time." Ethan's grip tightened on his makeshift spear as the faint hum of Soraya's device grew louder. The pulsating light it emitted illuminated her pale blue skin, casting a faint glow on her determined face. She was close to finishing whatever she was building, but the tension in the air was thick. He knew the pursuers wouldn't be far behind. "Is it ready?" Ethan asked, his voice low and urgent. Soraya didn't answer with words. Instead, she gave a quick nod, her delicate fingers still working on the final adjustments. The device emitted a sharp chime, then went silent. Soraya looked at Ethan, her violet eyes filled with both relief and fear. She gestured toward the sky, then to him, trying to convey something important. "You're saying, this thing will call for help," Ethan guessed. Soraya nodded again, but her expression darkened as she gestured back toward the forest. She mimed a sweeping motion with her hands, as if to say, "They'll know we're here." Ethan understood. Activating the device would signal not only her allies, if they were even close enough to respond, but also her enemies. Time was running out. The first sign of trouble came as a rustle in the bushes below the hill. Ethan froze, his ears straining to pick up the sound. Then he saw them. Two of the pursuers, clad in black suits, emerging from the trees. They moved with precision, their handheld scanners glowing faintly as they swept the area. Ethan glanced back at Soraya. She was clutching the device tightly, her body tense. She looked at him, her expression clear. "Do something." Ethan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. He picked up a handful of stones and tossed one down the opposite slope. The noise echoed through the forest, and the two figures immediately turned toward it. There, one of them barked in a guttural voice, pointing toward the sound. They moved in the wrong direction, giving Ethan and Soraya a moment of reprieve. But the relief was short-lived. Another figure appeared, this one larger, carrying a weapon that glowed faintly with blue energy. It scanned the hill, its movements deliberate and slow. Ethan's heart raced. He didn't stand a chance against whatever technology they were using, but he couldn't let them reach Soraya. "Stay here," Ethan whispered to her, motioning for her to remain hidden. She grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear, but he shook his head. "Trust me." He crept down the hill, using the thick vegetation for cover. The third pursuer was only a few yards away, its glowing weapon sweeping the area. Ethan waited until it turned its back, then lunged forward, striking with his makeshift spear. The sharp point hit the suit's shoulder, sparking faintly as it glanced off the armor. The figure stumbled but recovered quickly, turning to face Ethan. Before it could react further, Ethan grabbed a large branch and swung it with all his strength, knocking the weapon from the figure's hands. It growled, lunging at him, and the two tumbled to the ground in a chaotic struggle. Ethan's survival instincts kicked in, and he fought with everything he had, finally managing to pin the figure beneath him. But the noise had alerted the others. The two remaining pursuers appeared at the edge of the hill, their scanners now locked onto Soraya's position. Ethan's stomach dropped. Soraya, realizing the danger, stood up from her hiding spot. Her violet eyes narrowed with determination as she held the device high above her head. It emitted a sudden, piercing light that forced the pursuers to shield their faces. Ethan staggered back, blinded for a moment. When the light dimmed, the device released a low-frequency hum that echoed through the forest. The pursuers froze, their suits sparking faintly as they dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. Whatever Soraya had done, it had disabled them. Ethan scrambled to his feet, rushing back to her. "What was that?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Soraya pointed to the device, then to the sky, her expression a mix of hope and urgency. She mimed a flying motion, indicating that help was on its way, but only if they could hold out long enough. Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. "All right," he said. "We'll make it, I promise." But as the forest settled into an eerie silence, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was only beginning. The forest was unnervingly quiet after the blinding light faded. Ethan and Soraya stood side by side, their breaths heavy and hearts pounding. The pursuers lay motionless, their suits sparking faintly, rendered powerless by the device's strange energy. But Ethan knew better than to assume the danger was over. "That won't stop them for long," Ethan muttered, glancing at Soraya. She nodded, clutching the device tightly to her chest. Her violet eyes were filled with a mix of urgency and determination. Ethan scanned the forest. They needed to move. "Now. Come on," he said, motioning for her to follow. "We have to find a safer place." Soraya hesitated, looking back at the disabled pursuers, then at Ethan. She tapped the device and pointed upward toward the sky. Ethan realized she was trying to tell him something. "You sent the signal," he said, piecing it together. "Help is coming, right?" Soraya nodded, but her expression remained grim. She gestured toward the horizon, mimicking a countdown with her fingers. 5, 4, 3. Ethan's stomach tightened. If he was interpreting her correctly, they only had minutes before more of her enemies, or her rescuers, arrived. "All right," Ethan said, gripping her arm gently. "We'll keep moving until they get here. Stay close." The terrain grew rougher as they climbed higher into the forest. The trees became thicker, their roots forming natural barriers. Ethan helped Soraya navigate the uneven ground, his mind racing with questions. Who were these people hunting her? And why did she risk so much to carry that device? Their path led them to a rocky outcrop overlooking a steep valley. Ethan stopped, scanning the area. The vantage point gave them a clear view of the forest below, but it also made them exposed. He turned to Soraya. "We can't stay here long. Let's keep going." Before they could move, a faint hum reached Ethan's ears. His body tensed. The sound was familiar, mechanical and low, just like before. "Drones. Get down," Ethan whispered sharply, pulling Soraya into the cover of a nearby boulder. They crouched low, peering out as two sleek, metallic drones zipped through the air. Their glowing lenses scanned the ground, moving methodically. Ethan's hand tightened around the makeshift spear he still carried. The drones were faster and more precise than the human-like pursuers. They didn't rely on sight or sound. They scanned for heat and movement. Ethan turned to Soraya, who was gripping the device tightly. Her face was pale, her fear evident. "Stay still," Ethan whispered. The drones hovered closer, their scanning lights sweeping the area. Ethan held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. He could feel Soraya trembling beside him, her cold hand brushing against his arm. Suddenly, one of the drones let out a sharp beep and turned toward their hiding spot. Its light stopped just inches from their position, bathing the boulder in an eerie glow. Ethan acted on instinct. He grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it into the valley below. The sound of it crashing against the trees echoed loudly, drawing the drone's attention. They darted toward the noise, their lights fading into the distance. Ethan exhaled sharply, his chest tight with relief. "That was close," he muttered. Soraya looked at him, her expression both grateful and concerned. She tapped the device again, pointing to the sky, then to him. Ethan understood. She was trying to tell him they were running out of time. As they moved farther up the hill, the hum of the device grew louder. Ethan noticed that the air around them seemed to shift, almost as if the device was interacting with the environment. The faint sound of static crackled in the distance, followed by a low rumble. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, glancing at Soraya. She gestured toward the sky, mimicking the motion of something descending. Ethan squinted, trying to see through the thick canopy of trees. Then he saw it, a faint shimmer of light, barely visible against the blue sky. It moved slowly, like a ship cloaked in invisibility. "Your people?" Ethan asked hopefully. Soraya nodded, but her expression didn't ease. She pointed toward the forest below, where the faint hum of approaching drones and footsteps echoed once more. Ethan's hope was quickly replaced by dread. "They're coming," he said, gripping his spear tightly. "We have to hold them off until they get here." Soraya stepped forward, holding the device out. Its light began to pulse rhythmically, and the hum grew louder. Ethan watched as her fear transformed into resolve. She wasn't just waiting for help, she was ready to fight for it. Ethan nodded, standing beside her. "All right, Soraya," he said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." As the first shadows of their enemies appeared through the trees, Ethan braced himself. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it. Together, the hum of the device grew louder, resonating through the forest like a heartbeat. Ethan stood shoulder to shoulder with Soraya, his makeshift spear gripped tightly in his hand. The sound of their pursuers, the low hum of drones, and the crunch of boots on forest debris drew closer with every passing second. Ethan glanced at Soraya. Her violet eyes were sharp, her fear replaced by an almost unshakable determination. The device in her hands pulsed with light, each flicker seeming to respond to the energy around them. Whatever it wasn't just a tool. It was her only chance of survival. "They're coming fast," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "Do you have any more tricks up your sleeve?" Soraya didn't reply. Instead, she stepped forward, planting the device on the ground. It began to hum louder, its glow intensifying. Ethan watched as she pressed a series of invisible buttons on its surface, her hands moving with practiced precision. The dome of faint energy shimmered to life around them, crackling like static electricity. Ethan felt a slight buzz in the air as the dome solidified. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tinged with both awe and concern. Soraya turned to him, pointing to the ground, then mimicking an explosion with her hands. Ethan understood. It was a shield, a temporary barrier to buy them time. But it wouldn't hold forever. The first drone appeared, its sleek metallic body weaving through the trees. It hovered just outside the shield, its scanning light sweeping across the area. Ethan gripped his spear, ready to strike. But the drone didn't move closer. Instead, it emitted a sharp, high-pitched sound, a signal. "They found us," Ethan muttered. His muscles tensed as two more drones emerged, circling the perimeter of the shield. Moments later, the black-suited figures appeared, their glowing weapons drawn. One of the figures stepped forward, its voice cold and guttural. "Surrender," it said, the word distorted by its helmet. No escape. Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Soraya, who shook her head firmly. She pressed another button on the device, and the dome pulsed with a bright light, momentarily pushing the drones and figures back. "That's a no," Ethan called out, his voice defiant. The figures didn't hesitate. They raised their weapons, aiming at the shield. Blue energy beams shot forward, colliding with the dome and causing it to flicker. Soraya winced, the strain of maintaining the barrier evident on her face. Ethan moved closer to her, his instincts screaming to protect her at all costs. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm. "I'll handle them." Soraya gave him a small, grateful nod, but didn't stop working on the device. She was activating something. Ethan could see the symbols on its surface shifting and glowing in rapid succession. Whatever she was doing, it was their only chance. The first drone breached the shield, its lens glowing as it scanned their position. Ethan didn't wait. He lunged forward, swinging his spear with all his strength. The sharp point struck the drone's core, causing it to spark and fall to the ground in a heap of metal and wires. Not bad for a stick, Ethan muttered under his breath, his adrenaline surging. The remaining drones attacked in unison, their beams slicing through the air. Ethan dodged one and managed to knock another out of the sky with a thrown rock. But the figures were closing in now, their weapons tearing at the shield with relentless precision. "We're out of time," Ethan shouted to Soraya. "Whatever you're doing, do it now." Soraya looked at him, her face pale but resolute. She pressed one final button on the device, and a blinding column of light shot into the sky. The forest trembled as the light pierced the clouds, sending shockwaves through the air. The pursuers froze, their suits sparking and malfunctioning as the energy disrupted their systems. The remaining drones fell from the sky, crashing into the ground. The figures staggered, their weapons dropping as their suits powered down. Ethan watched in awe as the light grew brighter, its energy overwhelming everything around it. As the light began to fade, Ethan turned to Soraya. She was kneeling beside the device, her body trembling with exhaustion. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Soraya managed a weak nod, her violet eyes meeting his. She pointed to the sky, and Ethan followed her gaze. Through the thinning clouds, he saw a massive ship descending, sleek and otherworldly, its design unlike anything he had ever seen. Help had arrived. Ethan's chest heaved with relief, but the sense of victory was short-lived. The ship's arrival meant Soraya would be safe, but it also meant she would leave. He glanced at her, his expression conflicted. As the ship touched down, a new group of figures emerged, their movements calm and unthreatening. Soraya gestured to Ethan. The massive ship descended slowly, its engines emitting a low hum that vibrated through the forest. The sleek metallic surface gleamed faintly, reflecting the fading light of the sky. Ethan stood frozen, watching the awe-inspiring sight. For a moment, everything was still, the tension in the air replaced by a strange calm. Soraya stepped forward, her legs trembling from exhaustion, but her resolve unshaken. Ethan stayed close behind her, his makeshift spear still in his hand. He didn't know if they were truly safe yet, but he wasn't taking any chances. The ship touched down with a soft hiss, its landing smoother than anything Ethan had ever seen. A section of the hull shifted, forming a ramp that extended gracefully to the forest floor. From the ship emerged a group of tall figures, their movements fluid and purposeful. Their appearance was similar to Soraya's, pale blue skin, white hair, and piercing eyes. But their attire was more regal, their armor shimmering faintly with intricate patterns. One of them stepped forward, their gaze locking onto Soraya. They spoke in the same melodic, alien language, their tone filled with concern. Soraya responded weakly, gesturing to Ethan as she spoke. The figure's eyes turned to him, their expression unreadable. Ethan tightened his grip on the spear. "I'm guessing you're the good guys," he muttered, his voice low. He wasn't sure if they understood him, but he kept his guard up. Soraya, sensing his unease, placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was reassuring, and she gestured to the approaching group, her expression calm. Ethan took a deep breath and lowered the spear, though his grip didn't loosen entirely. The leader of the group approached Soraya, kneeling to examine her injuries. They spoke softly, their tone gentle, as they touched the strange device she had carried so protectively. The leader looked at Ethan again and, to his surprise, nodded. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight of acknowledgement and gratitude. Before Ethan could react, a pair of the figures stepped forward with a hovering stretcher. Soraya hesitated, glancing back at Ethan. Her violet eyes were filled with something he hadn't seen before, a deep sense of connection and gratitude. She gestured to him, then to her people, trying to convey something important. "She's trying to explain," Ethan realized aloud. "I helped her." The leaders seemed to understand. They reached out, placing a hand over their chest and bowing slightly toward Ethan. Though no words were spoken, the gesture was clear. They were thankful. Ethan nodded awkwardly. "You're welcome," he said, his voice soft. As Soraya was carefully placed on the stretcher, she reached out to Ethan, her hand brushing against his. He stepped closer, unsure of what to say. "Looks like this is it, huh?" he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and sadness. Soraya's lips curved into a faint smile, and she placed something in his hand, a small, glowing crystal embedded in a metallic frame. Ethan stared at it, unsure of its significance, but he could tell it was important. "What's this?" he asked, looking at her. She pointed to his chest, then to the crystal, her expression warm but serious. Ethan understood. It was a token, a reminder of their connection, and perhaps something more. The group began to ascend the ramp, Soraya's stretcher floating effortlessly alongside them. Ethan watched as she looked back one last time, her eyes meeting his. There was a silent exchange between them, a mutual understanding that transcended words. Then she disappeared into the ship. The ship's engines began to hum again, and Ethan stepped back, shielding his eyes from the light as it prepared to take off. In a matter of moments, the massive vessel rose into the sky, disappearing beyond the clouds as if it had never been there. Ethan stood in the clearing, the forest eerily quiet once more. The small crystal in his hand pulsed faintly, its glow rhythmic and soothing. He turned it over, marveling at its intricate design. It felt heavy with meaning, though he couldn't fully grasp its purpose. He sat down on a fallen log, the adrenaline finally leaving his body. The events of the past 2 days felt like a surreal dream, but the crystal in his hand was proof it had all been real. He looked up at the sky, his thoughts racing. "Guess my camping trip wasn't so boring after all," he said with a faint chuckle. As the stars emerged one by one, Ethan's mind was filled with questions. Who was Soraya really? What kind of life awaited her now that she was safe? And what did this crystal mean for him? Though he didn't have the answers, one thing was clear. His life had changed forever. The vast universe, once something distant and untouchable, now felt closer than ever. And somewhere out there, among the stars, was a friend he would never forget. The forest was quiet again, but Ethan's mind was anything but. Sitting on the fallen log, he rolled the glowing crystal in his hand, its faint light casting soft patterns on his palm. The events of the past days felt almost impossible to believe. A crash, a rescue, and an encounter with beings far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. He let out a long breath, staring up at the sky. The massive ship was gone, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Only the faint hum of the crystal in his hand reminded him that it wasn't a dream. Ethan's thoughts wandered back to Soraya. He wondered what would happen to her now. Would she recover fully? Would she ever tell her people about the human who had risked everything to protect her? The bond they'd shared, however brief, felt real. It was more than just survival. It was trust, forged under the most unlikely circumstances. As the hours passed, the forest began to stir with life again. Birds chirped, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. Ethan decided it was time to pack up and head back to his campsite. He had no idea how long he'd been gone, but he knew he couldn't stay in the forest forever. The journey back was uneventful, though his senses felt sharper, as if every sound and movement held new meaning. He replayed the events in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. Who were those black-suited figures? Why were they so desperate to capture Soraya? And why had she entrusted him with the strange crystal? When Ethan finally reached his campsite, it felt like returning to another world. The small tent and smoldering fire pit seemed insignificant now, like relics of a simpler time. He sat down and examined the crystal again, turning it over in his hands. "What are you?" he muttered, holding it up to the sunlight. The crystal responded, its glow intensifying slightly. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He tapped it gently, and to his surprise, a holographic image flickered to life. The projection showed a cluster of stars, their positions shifting as the image zoomed in on a specific constellation. Lines connected the stars, forming a pathway that ended at a single glowing point. It was a map. Ethan was sure of it. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Did she just give me directions to her world?" The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The map faded, leaving the crystal pulsing softly in his hand. Ethan sat back, staring at it. He had no idea how he could even begin to follow the map, but the fact that Soraya had given it to him meant she believed he could. As night fell, Ethan sat by the fire, the crystal resting on a rock beside him. The flames danced, casting shadows on the trees around him. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of purpose, a pull toward something bigger than himself. The world he'd known seemed so small now, compared to what he'd seen. The stars above felt closer, their mysteries more inviting. And somewhere out there, Soraya was waiting. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but the crystal in his hand felt like a promise, a connection that couldn't be broken. The next morning, Ethan packed up his campsite for the last time. He didn't know where his journey would take him, but he knew he couldn't go back to his old life. The crystal hung around his neck, a quiet reminder of the adventure that had found him. As he walked out of the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees, he felt a strange sense of calm. The dangers he'd faced, the decisions he'd made, they had all led to this moment. He wasn't just Ethan, a survivalist on a camping trip. He was someone who had stood up when it mattered, who had protected a life that was completely different from his own. And now, as he stepped into the unknown, he couldn't help but smile. The universe had opened a door for him, and for the first time, he was ready to walk through it. Ethan looked back at the forest one last time. The memories of Soraya and their journey etched deeply in his mind. He whispered softly, his voice barely audible, "Thank you, Soraya, for everything." With the crystal glowing faintly against his chest, he turned toward the horizon, ready to face whatever came next. The adventure wasn't over, it was just beginning.